Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is one of the monumental great works of Russian literature. But having said that, what makes this novel so profound? What about it has stood the test of time? Why are readers still nowadays reading it, digesting it, studying it, loving this novel, loving the characters? And what are sort of the underlying moral teachings, the philosophical teachings, religious teachings, and social instruction that Tolstoy offers us in this monumental work of Russian literature? So today we're going to get into sort of the background of Anna Karenina, do a little bit of an analysis. Lately, we've been kind of doing the live streams, which I really enjoy, but I thought maybe it would help to sort of concise a lot of the ramblings that we do in the live streams, condense it down to a shorter style formatted video. So I hope you guys will enjoy this. We just knocked out Anna Karenina roughly about a month ago. I finished it. I did take my time with this narrative. It's pretty massive, as you can see. This is my second recent Tolstoy reading. We just finished War and Peace about a year and a half ago. That was sort of my big reintroduction to Tolstoy. Prior to that, I think the only Tolstoy that I had read was The Death of Ivan Lynch. But I do think that speaking about Anna Karenina, it's really an entirely different novel in itself, obviously, than War and Peace. War and Peace is more like a universal, gargantuous, epic, philosophical narrative, whereas Anna Karenina is all of those things, yet it's more concise and sort of boiled down to the human experience, the human essence, versus the impact of war and how society pushes and pulls against the human relationships. Anna Karenina is more about the psychological and the spiritual rebirth, perhaps, of these individual characters and humanity at whole. And we also knocked out the biography by Rosamine Bartlett called Tolstoy, which puts a lot of Tolstoy's works into context. And just a little bit about Tolstoy, I would encourage you to read a biography. It doesn't have to be this one specifically, but I would definitely encourage people to read Tolstoy's life story because it helps you to understand his works and vice versa. If you just read Tolstoy's work, you'll be able to appreciate his artistic influence and you'll learn a little bit about the man himself. But unless you actually go straight to the source, straight to the facts, and really unpack Tolstoy's life as a whole, religiously, intellectually, and spiritually, you'll have a little bit missing. So I think the biography of Tolstoy really fills in the gaps for the artistic output of Tolstoy himself. So speaking of Anna Karenina, let's unpack it a little bit. So I will try to keep this video relatively spoil free. I don't want to tell you what's going to happen to each and every character, all the tragedies that occur in this. But in roughly around 1872, Tolstoy sort of witnessed a tragic situation that traumatized him involving a woman that had been somebody's mistress, an upper class woman. That's sort of how he was inspired to create the character of Anna Karenina. And what's interesting about Anna Karenina versus War and Peace, we get all the complex human relationships, we get all the interaction between all the characters, how they're sort of related to each other, how they relate to each other, how they impact and influence each other. But Anna Karenina, like we said in the beginning, is more boiled down to the human fragility, the fragility of human relationships, the failure oftentimes of human relationships, the ego versus the better good of humanity, the religious pursuit versus the intellectual pursuits, or the more earthly, selfish pursuits, perhaps. Now, I think in particular, Anna Karenina is a fascinating work by Tolstoy and a fascinating work of Russian philosophy, but Tolstoy was essentially a social and a spiritual philosopher. He was very political, very religious, very socially constructed, very socially concerned, I should say, in his philosophical dialogue, in his philosophical works. And if you study the life of Tolstoy, you'll know that he sort of started out in the sort of the upper class, aristocratic, maybe not quite an aristocrat per se, but definitely a wealthy landowner. He inherited a lot of wealth from his family. You know, he was sort of overseeing the serfs at his manor, and he served time in the Crimean Wars, I believe. But by the time he sort of reached middle age, he's still writing novels. He was still very influenced by art and literature, but his social conscience started to change, and he became, by the end of his life, Tolstoy was more like a philanthropist. He was more like a wandering fool, perhaps. He was more like, he still wrote literature. Even Anna Karenina in particular, he sort of denounced this novel as immoral. He sort of turned his back on a lot of his prior literature, which is kind of unfortunate, but Tolstoy was as close to a Christ-like figure as I think we could maybe imagine in the story of literature. He was the complete opposite of Hemingway in a lot of ways. He was the complete opposite of just any other writer you could possibly think of. Tolstoy was the complete opposite because he didn't just pursue the artistic rewards. He pursued the spiritual rewards, and he became an activist for the peasantry, really rebelled and passed more rights so that the peasants could be afforded more amenities and more rights and rewards. And Tolstoy was right there with him. And by the end of Tolstoy's life, he basically sort of became an opponent of the Russian Orthodox Church, or Orthodoxy in general. He sort of denounced Orthodoxy. He wasn't denouncing Christianity as a whole, but he was denouncing the structure of Orthodoxy because it had become so overblown. It had become so sort of geared towards money, all these sort of selfish pursuits. But what Tolstoy kind of teaches us is that religion, as well as philosophy as a whole, should be boiled down to its human experience. And Tolstoy even said that the closest thing to Christianity is basically to study the Gospels, to study the teachings of Christ, and that you don't even need to be in a church service to get close to God. So very fascinating, controversial ideas. So we're going to start to unpack a little bit of the narrative of Anna Karenina. A lot of these characters in Anna Karenina, you'll get to know them quite extensively. Some of them, I think, are maybe not quite as developed as others, but they all reflect Tolstoy's worldview. They all reflect Tolstoy's experience. Tolstoy was extremely depressed around the time of writing Anna Karenina, so it's a wonder that he was able to complete this. By the time he started, he was halfway, maybe a quarter of the way through, 75% of the way through. He was bored with it. He didn't even want to finish Anna Karenina. He started believing that it was immoral. But I think the most important things that we can take from Anna Karenina in particular is the fascinating way that the relationship of Levin and Kitty sort of combats or almost mirrors in sort of a opposite way the relationship of Anna Karenina and Vronsky, right? The relationship between Vronsky and Anna Karenina is rather sinful. They have to sort of practice in secrecy, at least in the beginning, and obviously it ends rather tragically. And whereas the relationship with Kitty and Levin is not void of struggles. It's not a walk in the park. It's not a picnic per se, but there's a spiritual transcendence that occurs in Levin and Kitty's relationship that we just unfortunately do not see with Anna Karenina and Vronsky. And the main reason for that, what I believe, my analysis, is that Tolstoy was kind of showing us that relationships that revolve around sin and secrecy and lust and betrayal cannot succeed on any level whatsoever, versus the sort of the more wholesome, spiritual, traditional relationships that we see in Levin and Kitty. Those are the relationships that thrive. And obviously these characters have immense, periods of heartache. They have periods of joy. They have periods of compatibility, and they have just immense character arcs in general. But none of these characters get through this novel without struggle, without a little bit of pain. Now, the first chapter opens up with the sort of an account of what was going on with Oblonsky, and his wife found out that he was having an affair. I think what's interesting that Tolstoy opens up the book with the concept of betrayal and sin. And obviously by the time we get to the book, we have the terrible results manifested of sin and betrayal and lust and secrecy. That is, Anna Karenina and Vronsky become complete victims of that. But there's other characters that get redeemed, like obviously Kitty and Levin. But there's almost a malignant, torturous, really dark energy that comes from Anna Karenina. And in one sense, obviously, Anna Karenina could not be redeemed from herself, but she could also not be redeemed by sort of Tolstoy's worldview. And I think Tolstoy was, maybe this was as close to he ever really got to sort of feminism, if we want to call it that. He was trying to put himself in the shoes of Anna Karenina. He was attempting to sort of see through the eyes of a lustful woman that, betrayed not only her husband, but sort of betrayed her own child. She sort of started denouncing and rejecting her own children as a result of lust and betrayal. And so he gives her a lot of stage time. He gives her a lot of analysis, towards the middle and end section of the book. And he tries as best he can. I think Tolstoy tried as strongly as possible to sympathize with the sort of mindset, the psychopathy of somebody like Anna Karenina. But you can see that he doesn't quite get there. He kind of ends up demonizing those type of people, and probably through no fault of his own. But I think it's a reflection of Tolstoy's own lustful feelings, his own relationship failures, even in the biography, he writes about in his journal how he hid stories about lusting for young peasant girls from his wife, Sonia, throughout their life. And when she found the documents, how horribly enraged and depressed she was. What's so important about Anna Karenina is that Leo Tolstoy is putting himself right on the chopping block, psychologically, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and socially. All of the things that Tolstoy is critiquing in this massive novel are all things that he's questioning about himself. And that's what makes this novel so profound. And I will say that the writing style is very descriptive. There's a lot of dialogue/action, but we get that classic rhetoric of Tolstoy just giving sort of his worldview, his perception. There's somewhat of an omnipresent narrator, but mostly the rhetoric comes from the characters thinking about themselves, reflecting on the people that they talk to. But it's in that sort of Tolstoyan, maybe slightly preachy manner that Tolstoy sort of constructs for us. He's almost acting like a sort of a voice of reason. But you could almost read Tolstoy's works like Anna Karenina as well as War and Peace as a form of scripture. They function as life advice, wonderful philosophical/religious life advice. Sort of the characters sort of start to develop, pardon me, it's a little hot in here. The characters start to develop under the context of the social class of Russia between, or the social complexities of marriage, liberalism in Russian context, the tensions of relationships, sort of the relationships between the upper class wealthy people as well as the underdog peasants. What are the tensions there? What are sort of the rising threats to the Russian oligarchy, I guess you could say, the Russian government? We have some ideas of liberalism and sort of social movements that are possibly a threat to the traditional Russian philosophy as it was known in the 1800s in particular. And Tolstoy adopts a lot of these challenging views. I mean, after all, we're talking about Leo Tolstoy, who was probably one of the first Marxists before Marxism was even a thing. But obviously, Tolstoy's worldview was not only for the sake of social revolution, it was also in pursuit of almost a religious transcendence, that by giving up his possessions, by living with the peasants, by working in the fields, sweating by the fruits of his labor, by denouncing his literature, by giving up meat. Leo Tolstoy was a vegetarian. He gave up alcohol at the age of 60 or 65. He sold all of his property. He no longer wanted to associate with traditional religions such as Orthodoxy. Through all of those things that somebody gives up, Tolstoy was trying as best he could to get close to, as much as possible, a Christ-like existence, a Christ-like figure within himself. And I think he got as close as a human being can possibly get to. He started to fast. He denounced eating meat. Just a lot of wonderful things in here that I can definitely get behind. But I think Tolstoy, by the end, a lot of it was kind of in vain because he sacrificed the happiness of everybody around him. And perhaps if he wasn't so doggedly distracted by radical politics at that time, I say radical politics. Nowadays, these ideas are pretty well developed. They're espoused by millions of people. But at the time, you got to imagine these were very radical ideas among the mass sort of population, right? In Russia in particular. Number one, because you had the very wealthy elite aristocrats sort of putting a blanket over the illiterate population of peasants. Most and the majority of Russian society was extremely illiterate. And Tolstoy actually worked throughout his life to educate the peasants. He ran schools for peasant children and peasant youths, and he translated the Gospels for a more approachable, easy, digestible way for the illiterate people to sort of understand the teachings of Christ. And he wrote an ABC book for kids, and just a fascinating character. But getting back to Anna Karenina here, we got a little distracted. We have this idea of man's duality of love versus self-doubt. A lot of these characters suffer from that traditional masculine insecurity, perhaps. They're battling their lust, they're battling views or the expectations that they have inherited from society, but they're also battling their lust, they're battling their temptations. We have these beautiful scenes in the beginning where, the male characters are trying to put themselves out there. They're sort of trying to flirt with the female characters to gain their attention, but they don't quite make it. They kind of fumble, and they go home and they start philosophizing, and that these women are, this woman couldn't possibly love me. And we have these wonderful character arcs, and sometimes the character arcs change from one chapter to the next, but obviously they change on a more drastic level from the beginning chapters to the later chapters. And we did sort of bring up, obviously Tolstoy was not a feminist per se. In a lot of ways, he was kind of the complete opposite, but we do have sort of a feminist undertone. And, my annotation here says beautiful descriptions of women and men's feelings together. And we have these wonderful sort of introspective scenes of how women feel about themselves and what sort of their plight was in Russian society, perhaps. So there is a little bit of the idea of the battle of the sexes, perhaps, in Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. It comes up. It's definitely a thing. As the novel progresses, we have obviously the affair that pops up between Anna Karenina and Vronsky, right? And she has these really interesting scenes where she's sort of trying to rationalize her infidelities. She's trying to rationalize the repercussions of betraying her husband, Karenin. We have the sort of the self-doubts of Vronsky, of what he's doing to this woman and her husband and her children. But they sort of have this narcissistic way that they rationalize their selfishness, perhaps. They have sort of this narcissistic way that they internalize the repercussions of what it is that they're doing to all the other people around them. And it's almost a compulsive affair. They can almost not help themselves. That's how bad their lust is. We have some really beautiful descriptions of female psychology, male psychology. We have a really interesting relationship between Levin and his brother Nicholas. They're almost sort of not necessarily at odds, but they don't necessarily agree politically and intellectually. The ideas of male insecurity sort of pop up. They have different views about how to bring the peasants out of their toils. And we have these wonderful scenes where Levin rolls his sleeves up and he gets right into the thick of things. He gets right into the sweat and the toil with the peasants. And he goes on these meditations of what it means to be a holy person, what it means to live a Christian life. And it's very similar to Leo Tolstoy's own worldview, that without the hard work and the sweat and the toil, you cannot really reach sort of a religious salvation, because you're not really putting yourself out there. You're not, putting yourself out there with the grand struggles of humanity. So we have mentioned some of the relationship struggles between Anna and Vronsky, but like we said, the relationship between Levin and Kitty is not void of problems as well. And there's times where they almost break up. Sometimes he believes that he loves her deeply. Other times he believes that he needs to take a different life path. And we sort of had this push and pull of the masculine ambition versus being rooted in sort of a domestic life, and that women sort of almost to a point sort of function as a threat to almost derail masculinity in a sense, or at least derail the stoic masculinity that Tolstoy was attempting to pursue throughout his life. Levin is pursuing these sort of, political ideologies that are sort of burgeoning in his mind. So he's sort of, a very progressive political and social thinker. And now he hasn't he's not at the point where he's got all the answers yet. And that's what makes this character Levin so fascinating, because he does not really have all the answers yet. He sort of has to try and fail. So that is one of the other profound elements of Anna Karenina, is how emotionally connected these characters are and how emotionally introspective they are. They're not shallow characters in any sense of the word. You don't really have to wonder what their motivations are. You might wonder what their next interaction is going to be, but you always sort of know what their underlying motives are. And sometimes I think it's sort of the opposite of like the Hemingway iceberg theory, right? Where there's a bunch of stuff under the water that doesn't really need to be said, because the words, the simplicity of the words and the relationships and the character action sort of speaks for itself without all the need for all this extra rhetoric. And we have some more dialogues about the rights of women in Russian society. So although it's not a feminist novel, several of my annotations come up again and again with Tolstoy trying to come to terms with the opposite of male and female sort of agency, right, in this semi-primitive Russian society. And that is sort of a reflection of what ultimately ends up happening to Anna Karenina, because due to sort of maybe the way the society was perceiving her, she was not able to just settle for the mistakes that she made. You know, of course, a lot of women had affairs, a lot of women committed adultery, but what drove Anna Karenina to sort of destroy her own life? You also have these male characters. They're very complex. You know, they reach forgiveness, they reach religious transcendence, they reach sort of affectionate feelings that they did not once have. And then sort of we have this interesting passage about halfway through the book. We have this beautiful passage of Vronsky and Anna. They start to become disillusioned. They sort of know that their relationship is a dead end. And it almost becomes like this idea of the emperor is wearing no clothes, or the emperor is wearing no pants. Everybody else can see all the fallacies and all the sin, the lust in their relationship. It's almost like they're looking at a leper, or looking at somebody with syphilis. Even though these people are not stricken with physical diseases, they have sort of a spiritual sickness. They have a spiritual, the priest in my church was talking about it today, sort of a spiritual paralysis. That's what these characters are almost definitely suffering from. They're suffering from the battles of not having a spiritual and sort of an emotional paradise that they've been able to reach, because they're shackled by lust, they're shackled by secrecy, they're shackled by betrayal. Ultimately, that's what drives Anna Karenina into the abyss, is because she cannot come to terms with what she's done to herself and her family. But also, it's interesting because we have so much feminist rhetoric in here that maybe Tolstoy was kind of saying that perhaps if Russian society was more forgiving of lustful women as they are men, perhaps Anna Karenina would have been able to pursue a little bit better and hold on a little bit longer. But there's basically no virtue. There's no salvation for Anna Karenina by the end of this narrative. Sort of by the end of the novel, obviously Anna Karenina sort of falls into the abyss, and I forgot exactly what happens to Vronsky. I think he kind of, we'll have to maybe get back to that later, but Dolly and Levin, although they've gone through all these struggles, their relationship is sort of like constructed as the pure, upright, moral relationship. And that's one of the strongest, if not the most important underlying theme of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, is the struggle between pursuing morality and battling the sort of the dark recesses of sin, lust, and betrayal. At least that's what I'm taking from it. It's kind of hard to ignore the way that Levin and Kitty's fairly functional and beautiful relationship sort of mirrors the decay of Vronsky and Anna's relationship. I mean, there's really no comparison, but they're obviously juxtaposed perfectly side by side as sort of a way to teach people which path are you going to go down, which worldview is one that you should be pursuing. You know, and I could see why Tolstoy sort of denounced this as a work of immorality, because although he was critiquing immorality, he was critiquing, infidelity, in a way it kind of celebrates and offers humanity to extremely flawed and lustful characters, right? So you could see by the time Tolstoy gets a little older and matures, he starts to view some of his older literature as just kind of like trash, although obviously it's not anything close to trash. It's some of the most profound work of Russian literature. it explores so many themes of lust and infidelity and frankly sin, that it was so in contrast with who Tolstoy wanted to be that I assume he started to view his own work as sort of immoral because it was maybe perhaps influencing people in the wrong directions, even though that was not the intention. We have some beautiful references to Shakespeare, Wagner, disillusionment with classical music as well as Shakespeare. That's a direct reflection of Leo Tolstoy himself. He sort of wrestled with his philosophies of Shakespeare. He ended up damning Shakespeare by the end of his life and said that he never saw a Shakespeare production that he actually enjoyed or that was, relevant. But I think he did try to understand the works of Shakespeare. He was obviously aware of King Lear and Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. So I think he appreciated Shakespeare, but like myself, we struggle to understand the complexities of Shakespeare, yeah? We have these beautiful meditations of the role of the church. We have these beautiful meditations of the teachings of Christ and how the social class, particularly the peasants, can only be redeemed through being religiously aware, being religiously literate. Obviously the peasants were probably loosely Christians, but they couldn't really read. They were taking everything at face value from what they heard when they went to church, maybe once in a while when they weren't working. Some of them were probably more devout, obviously. But we have these fascinating monologues of the conflicting views of how the Russian Orthodox hierarchy has constructed this ideal Russian society that's supposed to be moral, that's supposed to be religious, that's supposed to be for the better of religious fruitfulness. But how can that ever be achieved when the majority of the population is living in squalor and they can't read, they can't really understand the teachings of Christ? They're at the mercy of their priests and their overrulers and their owners. So we definitely get this, it's not just a work of fiction. When you read Tolstoy, you're basically reading works of history. It's as simple as that. I think that's kind of a good place to kind of end this. But I would say in a nutshell, Anna Karenina is a critique of religious and moral and sociological philosophy, but it's also a critique of love and relationships and marriage and when to get divorced, when should you not get divorced, what are the repercussions of sin and betrayal, is there a spiritual transcendence, what happens, when we die, does having a religion, does that necessarily 100% constitute religious salvation within life itself, but also in the afterlife? Is religion just sort of a mirage without the basic teachings of Christ? Is orthodoxy in a sense sort of a overblown, bloated cacophony of sort of misteachings, perhaps, is kind of what Tolstoy gets to by the end of his life. Obviously, Anna Karenina, these characters are influenced by people that he knew, people that he loved. Some of them are probably created, but they're all little bits and pieces of Leo Tolstoy himself. So that's why I will encourage you to read Anna Karenina. It's quite a bit shorter than War and Peace. Having said that, it's very, very dense, and the story moves rather slowly. It's probably not something that I would do a reread of like immediately, but I think I will come back to this the second time reading it in the future, and I'll be able to get into it even more because I've sort of lived these things and I've sort of reflected on all of these themes that maybe at the time I was reading it seemed a little tedious, seemed a little boring, but by the time it's all digested and kind of settling in your stomach and your spirit, these characters stick with you. You start remembering them. You start thinking you're about to face a challenge in your life, or you're about to face an interaction or a decision. You start thinking, what would Anna Karenina do? What would Vronsky do? What would Kitty or Oblonsky do? So, and that's what happened with War and Peace. That's what happens with the great novels, is that you take a little bit of their spirit on with you, and vice versa. You start to really live the great works, like Benjamin McVoy talks about. But there's sort of a debate on who really is the main character, and I think they're all sort of main characters because they all sort of mirror each other and sort of conflict with each other, sort of allowing you to see the deep recesses of the inaccuracies or the inconsistencies and the frailties of how all these characters are beautifully imperfect. Yeah, Tolstoy's balance of infidelity, harsh criticism versus nuanced sympathy for infidelity, like we kind of discussed. There's sort of a battle of worldviews. right? And I think that's why Tolstoy sort of ended up denouncing so much of his work, because there's such a struggle for morality versus what the upright worldview is. And of course, lastly but not leastly, we have the conflicting ideologies of agriculture, social class, religion, self-development versus narcissism. That's why Levin threw up his hands and rolled his sleeves up and started wheelbarrowing and digging dirt and siphoning in the fields with the peasants, because he felt like his life was too privileged. He felt like his life was too safe. He wanted to really experience what it was like to be out there in the world with the peasants. And we also have these beautiful meditations of what it's like to be close to nature. He sort of smells the soil, he smells the dirt, he smells the coming rain, and we get these beautiful meditations on how working in the earth from the fruits of your own labor, from the beauty of the earth, that's sort of a meditative sort of spiritual transcendence. So let me know if you guys relate to some of my analytical analogies in here, if you agree with my analysis. I'm not sure if we came to 100% conclusion of what the novel represents, but I think we got pretty close. Friends and family, we're probably going to put Anna Karenina up back on the shelf for the time being, but we're still going to be reading Tolstoy. We're going to be starting some other Tolstoy works in the next couple of months into the coming years. So I definitely encourage everybody to read Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy.